27, I went out with my friends one night downtown. I lived alone, and when my friend dropped me off this night, it was really late, around midnight. My friend drove off immediately, and when I was walking up to my front door, I felt very uncomfortable. I had a very strong feeling that someone was in my house. I stood at the front door and contemplated going inside, and tried to convince myself that I was just being silly. The feeling was too strong, and I was trying to remember if I had turned off all the lights in my house before I left. I never walk around my house and turn them all off before I leave. But this night, as I stood at the front door, every light in my house was off. I turned around and began walking away, and then turned the corner and started walking down the sidewalk. The friend who had just dropped me off lived about 8 blocks away, and I decided to just walk to her house. Shortly after I had started walking, I came to the realization that someone was walking behind me. I glanced back and saw a dark shape. It looked like a really tall man. It was so late and nobody was around. I was terrified. My heart began to throb in my chest, and I thought about sprinting the rest of the way. But I knew if I did, it would be very obvious that I was afraid. I couldn't bring myself to do it, but I was walking as fast as I could. I could hear the footsteps behind me, and it sounded like they had sped up with me, but they weren't running. When I finally reached my friend's house, my heart dropped into my stomach when I saw that her car was not in the driveway, and all her lights were off in her house as well. I turned around, and the man was standing on the corner of the intersection I had just crossed, staring at me. I froze and just stared back at him. After what seemed like forever, he finally turned around and disappeared behind some bushes. I took that opportunity to run. I knew of an alternate way to get back to my house, and I didn't stop running until I got home. My front door was wide open. I worked at a pretty well-known record store in Los Angeles in the 90s. A guy in his early 20s used to come in and ask me about records a lot, and one day in conversation, he let a weird detail about my life slip that I hadn't told him. I brushed it off, thinking my coworkers must have mentioned it to him since he was such a regular. About a week later, I was driving home, and my car broke down. It was incredibly hot, and I had to walk several miles to get to a payphone, which was outside an elementary school. I called a cab and hung up the phone, and after sitting a moment, the phone started to ring, so I picked it up. The person on the other end said, "Bad luck about your car. Talk to me until your ride gets there." I hung up the phone, but it was definitely that guy. He had to have followed me from home, trailed me from the car, and then somehow figured out that payphone number. There weren't really cell phones at the time, but there was a gas station and a grocery store across the street. I immediately quit my job and moved back in with my parents within 48 hours. I went in to visit old friends from work a few months later, and they told me that recently someone had been kidnapped right outside the store. I spent 6 months living alone in a cabin near the end of a dirt road in central New Hampshire. Nearest neighbors were a quarter mile or so up and down the road. It's an area where people definitely keep to themselves. I had all sorts of animal visitors, bears on the porch, you name it, but never random people around. One morning, I went out to my car to go to work. It was spring, and we had had a late frost. On the rear window of my truck, someone had written, I watch you, with their finger in the frost. I never had an actual problem in the rest of my time there, but as you can imagine, that was terrifying. I live by myself, and back when I first moved into my place, I went a few weeks without installing a cat door. So I got into the bad habit of leaving the back door cracked open a little bit for my cat to go in and out. But I would usually block the sliding door with a piece of wood or a baseball bat so that it could only open about 6 inches or so. My house is down a long driveway and my backyard is fenced, so I figured it would be okay short term. This particular night, I fell asleep watching a movie. I used to have a weekly overnight babysitting job for a couple who frequently spent nights in another nearby city caring for one of their ailing parents. It was an easy gig because they only had one kid who was an 8-year-old and pretty independent. I just played with him for a few hours and got him ready for bed, and then got paid for another 14 hours while I watched TV, raided their fridge, and slept on their couch. The one thing I hated about the job, however, was the house. It was a somewhat modern house in the country, and they had big open windows, and the style was such that there weren't any curtains that I could close. I just had to watch TV and live with the anxiety of knowing someone outside could be watching me, and I would have no idea. One night I was sitting down in the living room, and I thought I heard a noise, so I turned the volume on the TV down. Sure enough, what I heard was a slight tap, tap, tap. I looked around and didn't see anything out of place, so I assumed it was a noise from a tree or something outside. But every time I turned the volume back up, I heard that same tap, tap, tap. Finally, I turned the TV off altogether and started walking around the house. As my eyes adjusted to the darker room, I saw a man outside the window, fingernail pressed to the glass, making that tap, tap, tap noise, and smiling at me. I freaked out and sprinted upstairs to check on the kid, but the worst part was that there wasn't a phone upstairs, so I eventually had to creep back downstairs to grab a phone and call the police. I tried to avoid looking at the window, but I snuck a glance, and he was still there, just watching me calmly. I locked myself and the kid into his bedroom and waited for the police. They never found any trace of someone around the house, and I suspect that they thought that I was some kid playing a prank. But I know the person I saw was a full-grown man, and that he just stood there enjoying the fear that he caused me to feel. I'm an 18-year-old guy who lives with his mom. We don't live in the house I grew up in, but we are in the same neighborhood as my grandma's house, and only a minute away from all of my aunts and uncles and cousins. It's always been a nice and happy area for me because I grew up around here. To say it plainly, I love this place, and I feel comfortable almost everywhere in this city, Nothing bad has happened to me or any of my family members while we've lived in this town. It's close to the Gulf of Mexico, and it's full of chemical plants, and thus workers from chemical plants and their families. Most people mind their own business and have a lot of respect for hard work and integrity, but there are some crazies living here. There was a body found in a storage unit not too long ago. It was a woman who was murdered by her husband. He wasn't charged because he committed suicide shortly after. A man who used to work at the same power plant I work at now was arrested for killing a woman with his car and then driving away. The point being, shit goes bad sometimes here, but most of the time it's all okay. That's why I think this event is still a little shocking to me. It was a typical Thursday. I woke up at 7 a.m., went to work, and got off at 4. I went home and did all the normal stuff that I usually do. I took a shower, played some video games, smoked a little weed, and then ate dinner. Pretty good evening so far. My mom's friend April came over and stayed for a couple of hours. She lives a block away and walked but didn't want to walk alone in the dark. My mom told me at about 9 p.m. she was walking April back to her house and that it would only take a few minutes. I said, "All right, I'll see you when you get back." And then they left. No more than a minute later, I thought I heard tapping on my window, but it was so light and inconsistent that I still don't know if anyone was actually tapping on my window. I still felt a little paranoid, and so I turned on some music to distract myself. I turned it down a minute or two later when I thought I heard my back door open. It's very loud because of how old it is, and because of how we always keep the spare key in the lock, which jangles every time it's opened. I turned my music off and didn't make another noise for a minute. I didn't hear anything. I know someone opened it. I know someone was inside my house. I could feel it, but I didn't hear footsteps or a voice or anything. It was silent. I was kind of scared, but I quickly told myself to grab the knife I keep in my desk drawer, and then felt dumb because of the possibility that I was just being paranoid. Better safe than sorry, I guess. Once again, it was silent for a while. I thought that if I acted like I had the upper hand over whoever was in the house, they would be intimidated or scared. So I stood up and walked out of my bedroom, knife in hand. I don't know why, but I whistled just one note. I took a few steps forward. I was about to turn the corner and the back door would be in view. I stopped again and whistled once more, still thinking I was big and tough. I was about to walk around the corner, and then I heard something that made my hair stand up. I heard someone whistle back to me, clearly coming from my living room. I was terrified. I peered around the corner, and no one was there. The door was closed, but unlocked. I don't know if I left it unlocked or not. I truly can't remember. My mom came home a few minutes later, and I didn't tell her. Because I don't know. It's just weird, and it doesn't make sense. I really don't know what to think about it. But someone whistled back to me. About 5 years ago, my husband Adam and I decided it was finally time to start looking to purchase a house. We had always talked about buying an old fixer-upper home because we've had the idea that they hold more charm and character. Plus, we can appreciate a place that has its own quirks, and we love the thought of turning something run down into something beautiful again. With that being said, I grew up in a pretty rural farming town in Indiana that had more than its fair share of run-down houses. The surrounding areas had started to boom a little bit, with farmland being sold off and turned into new factory locations, along with new subdivisions for the people coming to work for them. I thought it would be a great place to start on our house hunt. I figured we would be a lot closer to civilization than I used to be growing up. but not so much that we would be living a stone's throw away from our neighbors. Adam and I decided to take a drive one summer Sunday afternoon so I could show him some of the back roads of my hometown and to also see what some of the properties we checked out online looked like in person. As we were turning off the main road through town and further onto a more secluded country road, we noticed that the very first house on the left was completely abandoned. We pulled into a small patch of the yard where the grass was shortest and where a gravel driveway used to be to further investigate. It was painted a deep green color, which made it almost invisible against the tall grass, sticker bushes, and weeds that had grown up around it. There was a massive tree in the front yard, and the branches and leaves helped to camouflage this place even further. The house looked as if it were at least 100 years old. It looked like it had sat empty for years. It looked neglected, weather-worn, and in need of some major love. In that moment, it was perfect. There was nothing but woods across the street and no neighboring houses in sight. So Adam and I thought it probably wouldn't hurt if we just trespassed a little. I completely justified my reasoning by thinking, we're interested in buying this property. We're not here to cause trouble. We're doing someone a favor. We could take this burden of a house off of someone's hands. We just need to take a look around first, that's all. There wasn't any no trespassing signs anywhere, so I was perfectly armed with my newfound inflated ignorance and arrogance to assess the property. We walked carefully through the brush toward the left side of the house, where we noticed a well that was still standing, complete with a bucket, a rope, a handle, and the original overhang. My excitement for a picturesque country house was building. Directly across from the well, there was a side entrance into the house through what looked like an added-on mudroom. The screen door to the mudroom was closed. However, there was a wooden door behind it that was half open. This was our not really intrusive because we aren't breaking anything to get in way of getting inside. It was probably in the mid-90s outside that day, so when we entered, Adam went first. We were met with thick, stifling heat. The kind that holds so much humidity that it almost takes your breath away. What we thought was a mudroom was an extended pantry area or canning kitchen. It was tiny, with one window, an old rusted sink, a small stove, and the walls still held shelves of canned and spoiled vegetables. I remember thinking, oh yeah, this'll be great. I totally remember how to can, and we can have a garden. It also had the doorway into the main part of the house, and this is where my elation came to an end. Through the doorway was the kitchen. What remained of the cabinets and the sink were against the wall on the left, but they were either broken or hanging on for dear life, or both. The kitchen connected to a wide open living area, with one side having walls streaked with black that led up to a half-sunken gray ceiling. There had been a fire at some point. The windows on that wall were filthy, covered in dust or ash that made the room much darker than it should have been in the middle of the day. My heart sank. I knew we wouldn't be able to afford a costly repair of a house fire, but I kept that disappointing thought to myself. The open living room area had not one stitch of furniture, save for one small wooden rocking horse that a child would have. The floor was littered with magazines, as if someone had a giant stack of them and just threw them in the air to see where they would land. Curious as to what the former homeowners liked in regards to reading material, I decided to check them out. Almost every single magazine was related to dolls in some way. Porcelain doll collecting, Barbie dolls, making dolls by hand, clothing for dolls. I felt a little creeped out by it, especially under the surveillance of the rocking horse's dead, painted-on stare. But I figured that an old lady must have lived in the house before, and I created a self-medicating idea that her husband probably died, and this was the only hobby that she had to pass her time. We decided to check out another room that was connected to the half-burned living area. Through the doorway to the left was a weird combination of a molded, stand-up shower with handicap handles, and an assisted toilet next to it divided down the middle by a wall. On the right was a wall made entirely of built-in bookshelves. The shelves were full of paperwork, manila envelopes, books, and even more magazines. It struck us as a pretty weird setup, but thought these people must have really loved to read while sitting on the toilet. My husband and I thought we could find out who the previous homeowners were, since some of the paperwork on top of the stacks seemed to be old bills. If we wanted to look up property records, at least now we would have a name to go on. I grabbed a stack of papers and began to flip through them. When about halfway through, they changed from being old telephone bills to printed out color pictures from the internet of porcelain dolls. I put the stack of papers back on the shelf and picked up a small, red, 5-star notebook. I started from the beginning, casually leafing through and seeing daily entries of medications taken, blood pressure, and glucose measurements written in neat handwriting. About 20 pages in, the entries started to change entirely. They became crude drawings of twisted faces, done in red ink. The faces had horns or bloody fangs. Then, full-on drawings of devils appeared in the pages after. I wanted to believe that a child had picked this up to doodle in, but I felt like this was something much different than that. After the drawings, the notebook became someone's personal journal, written in what I assumed was an elderly man's cursive handwriting. It told of how he knew he was coming toward the end of his life, and how he remembered being just a young boy when his mother passed away. He described in detail how the wake for his mother was held in the front room of this house, and how during those nights he crawled on top of his mother's body in her coffin to sleep. I couldn't believe what I was reading. Even though I had been sweating from the thickness in the air, a sudden rush of goosebumps came over me. I immediately showed it to Adam, flipping to the pages of devils and snarled faces, and then read aloud this stranger's memories of his mother, just to see if it was the same the second time around. After I finished, he said, "Well, this just got a whole lot weirder." While I was reading the notebook, he continued rifling through the mountains of papers. One stack not only had more printed pictures of dolls, but now they contained pictures of real women in torture bondage. Ball gags or electrical tape placed over their mouths, jumper cables twisting on their nipples, being hog-tied with rope. Sometimes there was more than one woman in the picture. It felt as if a brick had been tossed into my stomach. For some, those images wouldn't be disturbing, but in the context of our visit, my panic was starting to grow. I was torn between wanting to find out more and getting the hell out of this house. Adam reassured me that while it was on the creepy side, it wasn't anything to necessarily lose my shit over, since the women didn't seem to be suffering or bleeding. The burned out living area was separated from the rest of the house by a staircase. The staircase had a room directly across from it, and a small hallway on the other side that led to the main room at the front of the house. We debated on going up to the second floor, but decided against it, since it already felt as if we were roasting in an oven and were unsure of the stability of this second story. Going into the room across the staircase, we noticed a few more doll magazines on the floor, but not near the number as the other rooms held. There were scattered plastic doll pieces here and there, random arms and heads. To the left was the original fireplace, with a couple tiny vases on the mantel. Smack dab in the middle was a framed picture of an elderly couple, smiling and happy. These certainly weren't the type of people that would have pictures of women bound and gagged, hidden away in their bathroom. These people could have been my grandparents, I thought to myself. To the right was a big bay window, and smack dab in the middle was a yellowed piece of paper with faded black printed handwriting on it. It was for anyone on the outside of the house to see. Reading it backwards from inside, it said, "If you're here to talk about Jesus, go away." "That's kind of funny," Adam said after reading it for himself. "Yeah, it kind of is," I half chuckled. But something in my brain was now starting to nag me even more. Something wasn't computing correctly for me. Thinking back,